Almost every country in the world is in debt. The United States debt has now surpassed $38 trillion, the highest level in its history. The European Union carries around $14 trillion in debt, while Japan owes nearly $9 trillion from oil-rich Saudi Arabia to export giants like Germany and China. Everyone carries enormous amounts of debt. But this raises a strange question. If everyone is in debt, then who exactly are they indebted to? This is the world of financial history, where money, power, and history collide. And nothing is ever as simple as it seems. Debt is not just a burden. In fact, the entire foundation of the modern world is built upon it. Wars, crises, economic booms, and collapses all stand on top of this invisible system of debt. And if you follow the creditors long enough, you come across an unsettling truth. The world is not truly indebted to one specific person. The world is indebted to itself. But that does not mean everyone benefits equally. Today, total global debt has surpassed $315 trillion, nearly 3 times the size of the global economy. To understand how we arrived here, we need to look back. Long before credit cards or digital money existed, national debt systems emerged. In 1694, England was at war with France and running out of money. The king turned to merchants for help. In exchange, he promised to pay interest through future taxes. To manage this system, the Bank of England was created. It was revolutionary, because now the state could spend money it did not yet possess. And the lenders received something extremely valuable in return, a government-backed promise. In other words, government bonds. That was the birth of the modern financial system. France copied it. The Netherlands improved it. And the newly independent United States used it to finance both its revolution and its expansion westward. Debt was no longer seen as a sign of failure. It had become a symbol of power. Empires once conquered land to collect gold. Now they issued bonds to collect interest. Battlefields gave way to balance sheets. 300 years later, debt has become the world's greatest export. America owes $38 trillion, Japan owes more than $9 trillion, and global debt increases by nearly $1 trillion every 100 days. Everyone is in debt. Every bank lends money. Every citizen, through taxes and savings, becomes both debtor and creditor. So who is standing at the other end of the rope? Let's start with the US. Roughly half of the $38 trillion debt is held by public investors. Investors, banks, and funds. About 2/3 of those investors are American. Banks, pension funds, mutual funds, and the Federal Reserve. The remaining third is held by foreign countries. Japan is the largest creditor with $1 trillion, followed by China with $800 billion. So when people say America is indebted to China, that is technically true, but only for a relatively small portion of the total debt. Most of America's debt is actually owed to America itself. The Treasury issues bonds, and the Fed often buys them back. Americans pay taxes. Those taxes fund interest payments on the bonds, and those interest payments return to Americans through pension funds. The system functions like a massive mirror reflecting itself. The debt is real, but the creditor is often just another part of the system. Japan lends to the US. The US supports Europe. Europe lends to developing countries, who invest back into Western bonds. It is like a poker table where every player borrowed chips from the person sitting next to them, and the only thing keeping the game alive is that nobody stands up. But the most powerful part is not governments. It is the markets, hedge funds, central banks, and firms managing trillions. They decide which countries borrow cheaply and which pay high rates. When they lose confidence, currencies collapse and economies are reshaped. Democracy decides who governs. Markets decide who survives. Central banks do not merely manage debt. They also create it. Every dollar circulating today is, in reality, a representation of debt somewhere else. There is no such thing as debt-free money. This system has survived for decades because of trust. As long as investors believe, the machine keeps moving. But what happens when trust disappears? In 2010, Greece reached a point where it could no longer repay its debts. Investors panicked. The cost of that rescue was severe: higher taxes, wage cuts, and mass unemployment. In Argentina, repeated defaults turned debt into a national curse. In Sri Lanka, depletion of reserves triggered political collapse. When the system breaks, the real creditors finally become visible: the IMF, credit rating agencies, and bondholders. But here's the interesting part. Even after collapse, the exact same system starts again. New debts are used to cover old ones. Old debts get restructured. The machine simply keeps running under different names. Because today, debt is not designed to be fully repaid. The system was never built for that. Governments are not trying to eliminate their debt. They are trying to keep rolling it over continuously. When ordinary people take a loan, we are expected to repay the principal. But for governments, the situation is different. They issue new bonds to pay off old debt. Economists call this refinancing. So the system functions like a constantly renewing subscription. The real product is interest, almost like the rent paid for stability. And now, the global economy has become completely dependent on it, like a shark that has to keep swimming just to breathe. The United States will never fully pay off its $38 trillion debt. Japan has been rolling over its debt for decades. Its debt-to-GDP ratio has exceeded 250%. Yet interest rates there remain incredibly low, because investors are not expecting to get all their money back permanently. They are expecting the system to continue, because government bonds are considered the safest assets in the world. A US Treasury bond is not seen as mere debt. It is viewed as the foundation of global finance. Banks use it as collateral. Pension funds hold it. Central banks treat it almost like money itself. In reality, the entire system depends on governments never fully paying off their debts. What would happen if the United States somehow paid back every dollar it owed? Banks and investment funds would lose their safest assets. The global supply of dollars would shrink dramatically. Deflation and economic collapse could begin. In other words, paying off the debt could actually break the system. That's why governments continue issuing new debt constantly, not recklessly, but rhythmically. Debt now functions like the heartbeat of capitalism itself, flowing through every pension fund and market on Earth. That's why political promises about eliminating the national debt are often an illusion. The goal is not to erase debt. The goal is to make the system appear sustainable. Because if people lose faith in the system, everything stops. Interest rates surge, markets collapse, and an economy built entirely on promises grinds to a halt. That is the real secret of sovereign debt. The plan was never to fully repay it. The plan is to keep people believing it can be repaid. As long as trust survives, the numbers can grow forever. But trust is not distributed equally. The phrase "we owe the debt to ourselves" is only half true. Interest payments flow upward, from taxpayers and workers to large investors and financial institutions. So debt is not just a transfer between nations. It is also a transfer between social classes. That is why global inequality rises alongside global debt. The system rewards those who own debt. In reality, this same story exists at every scale, from households to nations, and from nations to the entire planet. Creditors are not necessarily villains. Debtors are not completely victims either. They are both parts of the same engine. The real problem begins when the engine runs out of fuel, when borrowing can no longer sustain old promises. That is when the question, "Who is the creditor?" stops being theoretical and becomes personal. Because at the top of this system, there is no single villain. Not just China, not just Wall Street, not just the IMF, all of them, and us too. The modern financial system has transformed debt itself into money. Governments issue debt, banks multiply it, investors trade it, and citizens become dependent on it. In the past, debt meant bondage. Today, it represents balance. But if that balance ever breaks, then we will remember what debt truly is, a promise that can never be kept forever. Subscribe.